There is nowhere in the world like Masada. An extraordinary place, a mountain fortress built before the birth of Christ. It rises out of the parched desert by the Dead Sea. And an epic story, how fewer than 1,000 Jewish freedom fighters defied the might of Rome for 3 years, how the Romans beat down fierce resistance, and how in the end all the Jews chose death over slavery. Today, using the latest scientific tools and re-examining the evidence, experts are piecing together a new story of the siege of Masada, one that could challenge a legend. Sunrise over the Dead Sea. Another blisteringly hot day dawns on the mountaintop of Masada. This is one of the most visited sites in Israel. It's become a symbol of Jewish defiance and heroism. Here, on this very spot, 2,000 years ago, hundreds of Jews took their lives rather than submit to the rule of Imperial Rome.
Masada has taken its place in the annals of military history as one of the great examples of a doomed and heroic last stand. It's up there with Thermopylae, it's up there with Custer's last stand.
There is a very eerie feeling there. And there is a strange feeling of a presence. And you stand there and say, wow, I mean, something happened in this place.
There are a lot of myths surrounding the siege of Masada. People absolutely still believe these myths.
In the 1st century AD, Masada lay in the Roman province of Judea. It was at the eastern edge of a Roman empire that encompassed the whole of the Mediterranean.
They refer to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. So that's from the Roman point of view, this is how they looked. That was the concept of the world. We are the masters.
But the Jews of Judea had never really come to terms with their Roman rulers.
There was something very special about this province. The Jews did not share the same attitude of most provinces of becoming sort of part of an empire.
It was just a matter of time until everything will erupt. Add to that a bit of fundamentalism, national pride, nationalism. You've got the recipe for a war.
In 66 AD, Judea erupted into a revolt which spread like wildfire. Rome's response was merciless.
People who have presumed to raise the banner of revolt against Rome have to be wiped out, and more importantly, they have to be seen to be wiped out.
Remorselessly, the Roman legions put down the revolt, besieging rebel towns, executing or enslaving the inhabitants. In the year 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem was sacked. This is where the myth of Masada begins.
We have tales of heroic freedom fighters fleeing a doomed and burning Jerusalem, occupying Masada, holding out there for years against all that the Romans can throw against them. And then at last, when it seems as though the Romans are about to break in, the freedom fighters kill themselves rather than live on as slaves.
The myth is a myth of heroism. It's a myth which ends with death, and it's a myth which states we prefer death over bondage.
The core elements of the myth of Masada are that the Jewish rebels were heroic freedom fighters, that the siege lasted 3 years, and that at its end, the Jews all committed suicide to avoid slavery. How much of this myth should be believed?
The story of the siege of Masada comes from an ancient Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus, who actually lived at the time of the siege.
Josephus had a bit of a backstory. He had originally been appointed to defend Galilee against the invading Romans, and no sooner had the Romans turned up and defeated him than Josephus was switching sides.
To the Jews, Josephus was a traitor to their cause. To the Romans, he became a chronicler of a turbulent period of history.
As Josephus writes it, it sounds as though he was a war correspondent on the spot doing his CNN stuff. That wasn't the case at all. Josephus was back in Rome, and the speeches that he gives to his protagonists are essentially invented by Josephus himself.
Can Josephus's account of what happened at Masada be trusted?
We know that he based his account upon the commentaries of the Roman commanders, which I think give even more validity to his narration to a certain extent.
He's so central to the understanding because he's the sole information. I mean, some things might be corroborated by archaeology, but there is no other source for the Great Revolt.
Masada is a magnet for archaeologists who are now beginning to test Josephus's history against the evidence they have found on the ground. This battlefield still holds many undiscovered clues. The arid climate has made this one of the best preserved sites in the world.
Everything is there, so it was left for us 2,000 years ago, and everything in a way is so dead but so vivid, archaeologically speaking.
Guy Stiebel is re-examining much of the evidence and exploring new areas of the site. These shards of pottery contain much information about the rebels on top of Masada. They are called ostraca, and the Aramaic inscription on one confirms the identity of a key figure on the Jewish side.
And this bears the legendary name of Ben Yair, which is the surname, if you wish, of Elazar Ben Yair, the commander of the rebels of the Sicarii at Masada.
This important find corroborates Josephus's account in which he describes a man called Elazar Ben Yair, leading a group of rebels on Masada called the Sicarii.
One of the things that you have to remember about Judea in this period, that is at the time of the revolt, is that Jewish society was divided into many different groups and factions, many of whom were fighting with each other as well as with the Romans. And one of these groups is this group that Josephus describes as the Sicarii, from the Latin word meaning dagger, sica.
Josephus reveals that the people leading the rebels, the Sicarii, were a fundamentalist sect.
One of the myths is that the Jews on top of Masada sort of died this heroic death as freedom fighters, when in fact they originally got their name because they were urban assassins.
The group that was on top of Masada was a group of assassins. Do you like assassins? Does anybody like assassins?
These were hardly the heroes of Judea. It's evident the role that the Sicarii played in the Jewish revolt, which started in 66 AD, has been manipulated by the myth.
They were simply kicked out of Jerusalem and never took part in the revolt after 66. Their leader was murdered in Jerusalem. And so the myth is exploded.
These were ideologically driven, violent terrorists. They were essentially the Al-Qaeda of their day.
Led by their charismatic leader Elazar Ben Yair, the Sicarii readied themselves for the Roman onslaught. Yet these die-hard fighters weren't the only people on Masada. Women, children, and refugees from Judea had also taken sanctuary there. But it was the Sicarii who were in control.
They were particularly fanatical. They believed that those Jews who were not part of their movement, their sort of apocalyptic messianic movement, were as bad as the Romans.
Legend says the siege of Masada lasted for 3 years. How could the rebels, surrounded by desert and trapped on this parched mountaintop, have possibly survived for so long?
One of the key questions in the desert is how on earth can you get hold of water?
The rebels had chosen their position carefully. 80 years earlier, King Herod had constructed an amazingly efficient water supply system for Masada. Excavations have brought to light an ingenious network of aqueducts that feed into more than 24 water cisterns.
What Herod did was something that is very typical to people who live in the desert. You make use of the water that runs during the winter when you have flash floods. If you can control this source, you'll be able to provide yourself with an enormous amount of water.
It's estimated that the cisterns on top of Masada provided the rebels with an incredible 40,000 cubic meters of water. This cavernous water cistern is almost perfectly intact.
Water was channeled down here from the plateau itself. So basically every drop of water, whether it was running down the canyons or up here on top of the mountain, was collected.
Evidence that this water cistern was virtually brimming full can be seen by the high watermark on the plastered walls. Water supplies were vital for the rebels, but so was food. These marvelously preserved dates, pomegranates, olive stones, salt, and walnuts were found on top of Masada.
They knew that the Romans will come, but they had a long time to prepare themselves, enough time to accumulate food, to bring water from the water cistern on the slopes up to the mountains.
The discovery of these huge storerooms suggests Masada held food supplies sufficient for many years. Josephus says there were 967 rebels. Though few in number, it seems they had prepared well for the Roman attack and could have sustained themselves for a 3-year siege. Down in these barren wastes around Masada, a Roman force of many thousands had arrived. Their plan was to surround and besiege the fortress. But how could they endure these incredibly tough conditions for a few weeks, let alone 3 years? It's mid-morning by the shores of the Dead Sea. At Masada, the temperature is already approaching 100 degrees.
You need to be here to feel the heat, and normally in the summer it can be unbearable.
It's striking how arid, desolate, and treeless a landscape this is. Yet the myth of Masada suggests that a Roman army endured these conditions in a 3-year struggle with a force of Jewish rebels amply supplied with both food and water. Could a Roman army numbering perhaps 10,000 really have survived in the desert for all that time?
Masada is certainly not a hospitable place for any besieger. It's set on the edge of the Rift Valley, the Dead Sea in front of it, the Judean desert behind it. There was very little in the way of natural resources here.
From the Roman point of view, the logistics of the siege must have been absolutely horrendous. Here at the base of Masada, in the middle of the desert, you had to provide food and water for at least 8,000 men, probably more actually, plus animals, every day.
It has been calculated that the Roman force encamped at Masada would have needed 25,000 liters of water per day to survive in the desert. The nearest spring that could supply the Romans with this quantity of water was at En-Gedi. Jody Magnus has come here to investigate the physical effort involved in transporting water 2,000 years ago.
I believe that they would have been bringing in water on a daily basis from the springs at En-Gedi and Jericho to the north.
These jars are filled with water and then loaded onto the backs of a team of 4 donkeys. As the donkey train begins its journey, Magnus sets her pedometer running. She wants to find out how far it is to Masada on foot.
You can imagine either mules, donkeys, or even humans were used to ferry water from these springs to the camps. And this was something that had been going on continually.
Magnus is discovering that it's very slow going. After 6 hours in the searing heat, they approach Masada. She takes a reading from her pedometer. They've traveled 18.13 kilometers, more than 11 miles. And this is just one way, and only 4 donkey loads. The Romans would have needed 200 animals, making a round trip of nearly 23 miles every day just to keep supplied with water.
This means the Romans would have had an interest in finishing the siege, bringing it to a conclusion as swiftly as possible, because the cost of bringing in that food and water every day would have been astronomical.
A challenge, but one to which the Romans were more than equal. This kind of exercise in logistics was far from exceptional for them.
From the Roman perspective, this was a very small army. They were used to supplying armies of 35 to 70,000 men, even in inhospitable terrains. So it was something the Romans were very skilled at.
They were also skilled at storing food and drink, even in difficult conditions.
In our excavations here in the siege works, we made an amazing discovery. When we excavated inside the tent units of the camp here, we found that the floors of the tent units were covered with layers of broken potsherds.
These pottery fragments were painstakingly put back together.
One of the things that I wondered about is, well, we have lots of storage jars, so we could see that this is where they were storing their food, but what about the dishes that the soldiers used to dine off of?
And how did they cook such vast quantities of food in the middle of the desert?
And then it occurred to me, usually in the field, soldiers would carry their own mess kits with them.
A discovery from a Roman camp provided confirmation.
One of the most exciting artifacts that was found was what you would call today in any army, this is a mess kit basically, made of copper alloy. And this what every soldier used to have. This was his part of his personal kit. And this is what they were using, they were eating, you can boil, you can cook.
So the Roman force ensured that it was both well supplied and well fed. But what of the soldiers themselves? Legend has it that they would have struggled in the vicious heat of Judea.
There's no question that the Roman legion was the best military unit of its time, and perhaps of all time.
The soldiers at Masada, the 10th Legion, would have been Roman citizens. The fact that they're Roman citizens means they could come effectively from anywhere in the empire.
Now evidence has emerged about the likely makeup of the 10th Praetensis, the legion sent to besiege Masada. These delicate fragments of papyrus are the remains of a payslip of a Roman soldier.
This is a unique document. There are 3 or 4 salary bills of soldiers of the Roman army from the entire Roman world. And this one was discovered on Masada.
We can't tell where it came from, his name, his origin.
The man is clearly a soldier in the 10th Legion. And as we can see with his name, Gaius Mestius Gai Filius, son of Gaius, from the tribe Fabia, Beiritensis. In other words, he's a Roman soldier recruited in Beirut into the 10th Legion, who was brought over to Judea during the Great Revolt.
The crucial piece of information is that Gaius Messius was a Roman, but not from Rome. He came from Beirut, which was then a Roman colony in the province of Syria, just a stone's throw from Judea.
He was part of the army that put siege on Jerusalem. The 10th Legion had great experience in building siege works, and of course was the legion that conquered Masada.
Many of the soldiers in the 10th Legion are Syrian, and the tradition of Syrians coming down and invading Palestine, Judea, is a long one. So they are seasoned, practiced, and very, very experienced, terrifying adversaries.
Messius was from Syria. He had 7 years' experience fighting the Jews, and he was a native of the region, well used to the harsh climate. Yet the document reveals more.
It tells us about a unit that we don't know much about in the Legion.
There we have the list of the stoppages, the deductions. A great deal was spent on horse fodder, which makes me believe that this is an equus legionis.
An equus legionis was a cavalry soldier.
Most of the legionaries were foot soldiers, but we know from Josephus there were 120 cavalrymen, and he was one.
There are so many important things in this document. It looks, at first sight, nothing too much to see, but in fact, it's tremendous. It has so much information, and there are still puzzles that I haven't yet figured out.
So a revealing picture is emerging of the Romans at Masada. This was a battle-hardened force of infantry and cavalry, well supplied and eager to get the siege over as quickly as possible. But there was still one huge obstacle in front of them. How would they capture a fortress that had never been taken before? Masada is within sight of the Dead Sea, the lowest place on earth. But for the Roman forces to succeed in capturing it, they would have to conquer great heights.
The actual name of Masada in Hebrew, Masada, is a fort. Ever since it was built, it was taking the advantage of those sheer cliffs behind us.
The fact that it's situated on top of a tall cliff face, it's an isolated plateau top, detached from the surrounding hills, makes Masada a difficult target from a natural point of view.
The fortress was built upon a 1,000-foot-high tabletop mountain. Around the perimeter was an 18-foot stone wall interspersed with towers. There was no prospect of starving the rebels out, so the Romans decided they would have to somehow get up to the level of these fortifications in order to launch an assault.
Once you're on top, it's relatively easy to break through. The challenge for the Romans, of course, is to get their siege equipment from the bottom to the top.
Flavius Silva, the Roman commander, ordered the building of 8 fortified camps to house his troops and an encircling wall to completely surround Masada.
Flavius Silva's brief must have been fairly clear. Stamp out the last embers, don't let anyone get away. So the purpose of this wall was to keep the defenders in.
Much of this wall and the camps are still intact today. Each camp had a specific purpose. This one was Flavius Silva's headquarters, and on this cliff, facing the southern end of Masada, a camp was constructed to overlook the rebels. All this would seem to be a massive undertaking. Another reason why the myth of a 3-year-long siege has persisted, wrongly as it transpires.
We have to understand that the Romans were among the best people ever to build siege works. And so they could have done this as quickly as, and probably more quickly than anyone else.
To build a camp with tents will take you a few hours, a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week. It was done very quickly.
The camps also served another purpose.
It enables them to bring a piece of Rome, a piece of civilization, to even the wildest, most rugged, most intimidating environment. And in a sense, the landscape in which the rebels have taken shelter, because it is so inhospitable, because it is so un-Roman, also has to be tamed. Not only are the rebels going to be wiped out, but the rugged terrain itself is going to be brought under Roman control once again.
Like the Roman camps, the encircling wall had a dual role. In places, it extends up and along steep slopes.
The wall of circumvallation surrounding Masada extends over some pretty difficult terrain. The wall is really a form of engineering overkill.
If you look at the architecture of imperial Rome, it's designed to stupefy, to overawe, to intimidate. And I think exactly the same principle is in evidence at Masada. The besieged can look down and see these terrifying works being thrown up, and it fills them with a sense of awe and terror at the nature of the enemy.
The rebels were about to undergo the bitter experience of other Judean strongholds.
Between the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of Masada, there was a gap of 3 years. What happened within these 3 years?
In the myth, the Romans spend all this time besieging Masada.
You'll often hear that the siege lasted 3 years. It's very clear from Josephus's account, however, that there wasn't a siege in those 3 years.
In fact, the 10th Legion spent this time mopping up the last remnants of rebel resistance across Judea.
In a very typical Roman way, step by step, side by side, just erase any resistance, leaving Masada for the end because Masada is naturally fortified.
They began with the nearest fortress at Herodium, then moved on to Machaerus, then finally Masada. By late 72 AD, Rome was turning its attention to this last Jewish stronghold.
The Romans wanted to go there towards the end of the winter, but before it's getting too hot.
This is when the most water is available. This is when the weather is relatively cool. This is the perfect time to come to Masada.
Yet everything was geared to the assault on the fortress itself. This would be achieved by building a massive siege ramp. Investigating this vast piece of ancient engineering could provide compelling evidence for the real length of the siege of Masada.
The ramp at Masada is perhaps one of the most dramatic Roman assault ramps that exists today.
The siege ramp would enable a tower housing a battering ram to be brought up to bear upon the walls of Masada.
The length of the siege is simply the amount of time it would have taken the Romans to build the siege ramp. The Romans had been fighting this kind of war for centuries. So every single soldier in the 10th Legion had built a siege ramp, in fact, probably several siege ramps.
But because Masada was so elevated, the Romans were forced to build their ramp at a steep angle. Was this the reason why the siege was supposed to have lasted 3 years? Structural engineer John Roberts has come to investigate.
I'm standing about halfway up the ramp up to the wall, and we must be somewhere on the edge of the ramp. These pieces of timber have been laid in with the stone and the rock pieces, and they're crisscrossed, so they're laid in one direction, and then they're laid across it, the next layer in the next direction, and then the next layer like that again.
These pieces of extraordinarily well-preserved timber were individually laid by Roman hands. They reveal the secret of the ingenious engineering design behind the ramp.
The crisscrossing of the timber forms little compartments where the stone pieces can go, and it makes the ramp edges able to be built at a much steeper angle, and so it saves material.
This technique reduced the time it would have taken to build the ramp. But where would the timber have come from in such a treeless landscape? Much of it would have been carried on foot. However, recent scientific research is suggesting another possibility.
We found that the wood in the ramp is actually mostly tamarisk tree. Over 90% is tamarisk tree, which is a local wood. This was important because that means they didn't use imported wood from wetter areas.
Cellulose was extracted from the tamarisk wood for isotope analysis of the carbon and oxygen content.
Every element comes in different types and flavors, which we call isotopes. And this is true for carbon and oxygen. They have different isotopes that are slightly different in mass.
The mass of carbon and oxygen isotopes in a piece of wood reflect the environment in which that tree was growing. Yakir compared the isotopes of the ancient tamarisk wood from the Masada ramp with samples of tamarisk growing in the region today.
What we found is that the tamarisk tree from the Roman period had a smaller proportion of the heavy isotope of carbon and oxygen than the tamarisk growing around Masada today.
What this means is that tamarisk trees 2,000 years ago were growing under milder and wetter conditions than exist today.
Even slightly wetter condition probably meant more trees, and this would be consistent with a huge amount of tamarisk tree found in the ramp.
With a ready supply of timber, the soldiers could have built the ramp more quickly.
In arid conditions like Masada, you only need a few % more rainfall, and that can have a major impact on the conditions.
A small variation in climate would have produced a different landscape. This revelation is forcing experts to rethink the whole conduct of the siege.
Obviously, if there were wetter conditions, it would be easier on the Romans as well as on those on Masada. There might be more shade, it might be less troublesome to fetch water.
Building materials may have been easier to get hold of, and conditions not quite as severe as they are today. But the Romans still had a mammoth task in front of them. This is the Roman siege ramp at Masada. To look down on this area 2,000 years ago would have been to view a vast construction site.
The whole site must have been full of dust, chaos, noise. And again, for the defenders up on the summit to look down and see this monstrous work, to see earth being shoveled up against what they had always assumed was an impregnable position, must have been terrifying.
Day by day, the ramp inched upwards. Most experts now believe it was built in less than 6 months. But how could so much stone have been quarried in that time? Geologist Dan Gill has taken a closer look.
We are here on the northern flank of the ramp. The ramp is on this side, on the right of me. Upon close inspection, it's very evident that we are dealing here with natural strata.
Scrutiny of the ramp indicates it was built upon a spur of rock that protruded from the western side of Masada. Much of what appears to be man-made is in fact natural.
The Romans had to look for a place where the crest of Masada is closest to the surrounding. And as Josephus tells us, there was only one place where this condition is met.
On the eastern side, there is a sheer drop of 1,000 feet, but that shrinks to 300 on the west.
The Romans built their ramp on top of this natural projection, which already gave them a height advantage. It gave them a head start in the building of their ramp.
How much was the Roman workload reduced by taking advantage of this rocky spur? Gill has decided to find out by conducting a geophysical radar survey of the ramp. This painstaking scan involves sending pulses of energy down into the ground and measuring the point at which they are reflected back. The aim is to locate the level at which the man-made material ends and the natural rock begins.
As you see here, we get strong reflection relative to the other reflection in the area. And I think that this is the reflection between the
artificial fill and the bedrock.
Gill and his team have found the level of the natural spur of rock within the ramp. The survey indicates the amount of artificial material piled up by the Romans is in fact quite small.
The artificial addition does not amount to more than 10% of the geographical feature which we observe today.
This illustration of the ramp shows where the natural level of rock lies. It's clear that the building of the ramp, though an impressive piece of engineering, was not as daunting a task as it first appears.
The construction of the artificial ramp could have been accomplished in a matter of 3-4 weeks without any problem.
With the ramp finished, the Romans were faced with a problem of how to get their huge siege tower up a 20-degree slope.
This is just a 10-kilogram weight on a very crude base. It's not a representation of the siege tower. It's just to demonstrate how much force you need to pull a weight up this sort of slope. This is a measuring device which will just record the force to pull this up the slope. And if I actually pull it up the slope, I'm getting a reading of about 4 kilograms to pull this up the slope. So it weighs 10 kilograms, and I need to pull it with a force of 4 kilograms. If you scale that up to the Roman siege tower, which I think weighs, say, 70 or 80 tons, you would be pulling it up with a force of 30 to 35 tons to move it up the slope.
Roberts calculates that it would take more than 300 people to generate such a force. But the practical difficulties leave him perplexed.
Because I'm a structural engineer, I sit there and I'm interested in, well, how was it built? What did it weigh? How was it moved? What's your view on that as an archaeologist?
Well, there are two basic views, I think, that the siege tower was either prefabricated at another location and pushed, winched, somehow moved up the ramp, or alternatively, it was taken up in parts and assembled at the top.
If you split it into 6 pieces or 8 pieces, they're still going to weigh about, say, 10 tons each. It's okay to drag 10 tons up the slope. That's not too bad. But to lift 10 tons on top of another piece is really difficult, especially if you're right in the line of attack.
So if the siege tower wasn't assembled in stages at the top of the ramp, how did it get up there?
The other alternative is to move it up in very short steps.
Right. How short would you?
Oh, I think down to maybe just a foot or so at a time even. Really short steps.
And then you put chocks under the wheels?
Each time you move it forward, you chock it.
Right.
And then you can use the same arrangement, whether it's a winch or a lever, to move it the next foot. And it just goes gradually up the slope.
Nobody knows for certain which method was used, but evidence of fighting has emerged that suggests the siege tower did make it to the top of the ramp.
We're at one of the most important points, speaking about the actual siege. Excavating this area, we were able to reconstruct, if you wish, the scenario of the actual fight.
As well as a bombardment of arrows and handheld missiles, massive rolling stones like these were hurled down on the legionaries. Stiebel has investigated how the Romans countered these attacks.
We found several dozens of ballista balls scattered around this area. This was a sort of an ancient cannonball that was shot from below up here.
From the fall of the shot, Stiebel has plotted a graphic map showing precise lines of Roman artillery fire.
You can actually see a pattern. There were at least 3 lines of fire. What you can see is actually how the Romans were thinking.
Their artillery was methodically targeted, laying down a lethal suppressing fire, driving the rebels away from the battlements.
Just imagine 55 such machines shooting constantly. You can just hear the noise, the roar of those arrows just...
The defenders at Masada had no access to catapults. They had no access to artillery.
Artillery gave the Romans an important advantage. But for targeting individuals at close range, a more mobile weapon was needed. These curious curved stones, found both in the Roman camps and along the battlements, immediately excited the interest of archaeologists.
Very conspicuously piled up were stones, natural river pebbles, about the size of a large egg.
This is normally a rock that you wouldn't find on top of Masada. Finding it up here suggests that there were indeed slingshots, and they were found in huge numbers all around me.
And the Romans had the perfect soldiers for using the slingshot.
According to Josephus, they had Arabian and Syrian slingers. They were specialists, presumably.
Muhammad Hamayes was taught to use the sling as a child. The deadliness and accuracy of this weapon is clear. At close range, it's lethal. So at Masada, a combination of artillery and slingshot enabled the Romans to bring their battering ram right up to the walls. Now it was just a matter of time.
As soon as the battering ram started its job, the wall would have started crumbling fairly quickly.
In their desperation, the rebels had thrown up a second wall of wood and earth, which was briefly effective in absorbing the blows of the battering ram.
This secondary wall was extremely susceptible to fire, and the Romans deployed incendiary missiles, and pretty soon this whole structure was ablaze.
As darkness fell over Masada, the rebels' fate was sealed. Night on Masada. Fires burn on the battlements. A grim choice faces the rebels.
Think about nearly 1,000 Jews. Let's say 400 would be fit to fight. The rest were just elderly men and women and children. Both sides knew that once the sun is up again, they're doomed.
The story goes that the rebels choose to take their own lives. Lots are drawn to decide upon the 10 men who will do the killing. Belongings are ceremonially burnt, and then the heroic last act of defiance, the mass suicide pact, is carried out. In the morning, the legionaries enter the fortress expecting a final fight. What they find instead are corpses. What evidence is there to actually support the story of mass suicide? controversy has surrounded a group of ostraca identified as the lots.
The people who excavated Masada in the early 60s found, quote-unquote, the lots, but did they?
Here are 10 ostraca with names on them, and one of them was Ben Yair. Now, if there's anything that's common on Masada, is ostraca with names. There are very many.
In fact, it's possible that they weren't lots at all. We do have ostraca from other places around the top of Masada, which were used for things like meal ration tickets.
And was the suicide really the united act of the myth?
It's not a simple thing to kill oneself. It's not a simple thing to commit suicide. It's not a simple thing to have a father or a mother kill her own children on a mass scale like this.
Josephus records that a group of 7 women and children escaped death by hiding.
And now, why did they have to hide themselves? I mean, the fact that Josephus says that they had to hide themselves implies that there might have been some element of coercion in the suicide.
So was the suicide a forced act? Other troubling questions need to be answered, such as what happened to all those bodies? Excavations in the 1960s unearthed just 25 skeletons and a few poignant human remains, these braids of hair and some sandals. In 1969, the Israeli government gave the skeletons a state burial, honoring what it saw as the heroes of Masada. But were these the right bones?
There are a few indications that the bones might have not been bones of Jews. First of all, the nature of the bones, the type of bones, they didn't fit the local body structures.
It's been suggested, for example, that they're not Jews, but they're Roman soldiers, because pig bones were found in the cistern with them.
The Roman legion which put the siege on Masada was the 10th, Fretensis. One of the symbols of that Roman legion was a pig. So finding pig bones with Roman soldiers that were part of the Roman 10th Legion makes a lot of sense. I think most of the people who knew suspected, more than suspected, that the Israeli army in the state of Israel was actually burying remnants of Roman soldiers. And the historical irony is hilarious.
If they were Romans, where are the bodies of the 960 suicides?
Certainly, they wouldn't have left decomposing corpses lying around. No matter how the Jews died and how many of them died, those remains would have been disposed of by the Romans, either buried in a mass grave somewhere or cremated.
Whatever happened at the end of the siege, it seems clear now that for the Romans, this was a relatively routine and swift operation.
I think 7 weeks, in fact, I think is a very generous estimate in terms of the amount of time it would have taken the Romans to take Masada.
Masada is a dramatic event, a dramatic episode, but at the end of the day, it was just another battle.
So why did the Romans, 3 years after the end of the Judean revolt, bother with Masada?
Money, money, money.
It's an absolute principle of Roman military policy that war has to pay for itself. The conquered have to pay for the privilege of being defeated.
Now evidence has emerged that indicates perhaps the real motives behind the siege. 2 tiny fragments of papyri found on Masada bear the word xylobalsami, meaning balsam wood. 2,000 years ago, the oil from balsam wood produced a much prized perfume.
Now we know from the papyri that the balsam industry somehow is connected with Masada.
The sole source of balsam wood was close enough to Masada to be threatened by rebel raids.
The reason for going to Masada was actually En-Gedi, which was a small Jewish village, however very, very important. But this is a place where they grew one of the most expensive, or actually the most expensive perfume in the entire Roman world.
The Roman writer Pliny the Elder records that in the 5 years following the end of the revolt, the balsam industry at En-Gedi was worth 800,000 sesterces to the coffers of imperial Rome. In modern money, this is the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars.
By wiping out the defenders at Masada, the Romans are setting the seal not only on their military but also on their economic control of Judea.
The myths of Masada may linger on, but in truth, this was a brief and brutal affair. On that dramatic night in 73 AD, when the rebels met their horrific end, the Romans were just notching up another victory.